They called us rednecks back in the 1920s because striking workers from all different races wore red bandanas around their necks as they fought and died for respect and a living wage.
It was a rare sight to see someone like John Russell, a self-described dirtbag journalist from West Virginia, walk up to the podium at this year's Democratic National Convention in Chicago. He took to the stage in a classic Western work shirt with pearl snaps and a mullet to speak directly about the essential labor of rural working-class people, their solidarity across race, and the need to return to their political home in the Democratic Party after decades of both parties putting profit over people. Following that speech, social media was buzzing with debate about the origin story of redneck, a word with historical roots as a condition of sunburned laborers, derogatory slang for rural white people, and as a lesser-known point of pride for striking workers. The multiple meanings reflect a history of misunderstanding rural people by folks who live in big cities. Stereotypes about the monolithic rural voter prioritizing racism over economic self-interest persist in the news and gotcha moments online. It goes both ways, as coastal elite has become synonymous with urban voters who are out of touch with the everyday concerns of working people, who think of rural voters as ignorant pawns in a political game. These misconceptions reflect the rural-urban divide. It's one part of the political polarization in recent years. Orlando, our New York City voter from episode 1, is back to talk about his perspective on that geographical chasm. There's talk about coastal elites and urban voters versus rural voters. That's part of this rural-urban divide. What do you think about this?
And it's funny you bring that up because I often hear that and I think, are they talking about me? Like, I'm certainly by no means elite. I don't consider myself that way. But if I were to sit down with someone living in, somewhere in Iowa or Idaho or wherever, I imagine there'd be a really tremendous difference between our lives, and they might lump me in that category. I don't know. What they're experiencing is a lot different. I mean, I've certainly never had to even consider the idea of a coal plant shutting down. That's never been my experience. But then it comes down to, so what do we consider elitist? Like, what are we defining that as? Is that just a lifestyle? Is it strictly economic? Ultimately, I think it's just another way to pit people against each other. It really just creates this divide, and then suddenly it's like us against them.
So do you think there's a way to overcome that divide or that tension?
I don't. I think that as long as there is such vast economic disparity, and people are feeling that so intensely, I don't see how you overcome that.
Well, maybe we need more progressive economic policies.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, we could overcome it. Can you imagine it? Maybe not.
There's an idea. I believe that's been floated once or twice, but it hasn't really caught on yet. It really hasn't.
This is Shifting Terrain. I'm Rachel Rybaczuk, a working-class sociologist and organizer. I've spent a long time thinking about race and class, most recently in politics. In today's episode, we'll be taking a deep look at working-class voters in rural areas and why their concerns are still relevant in between elections, how their values overlap with urban voters when it comes to abortion, and differ when it comes to who they trust for information. Also, why lawn signs are actually effective. A quick note to listeners, when I recorded this next interview, I had a cold, so you'll notice a difference in my voice, but it's still me. Today on Shifting Terrain, I'm joined by Sarah Jaynes, Executive Director of Rural Democracy Initiative, who has many years of experience as an organizer with a big picture perspective on organizing in rural areas. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to Shifting Terrain.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
The first episode was about who working class voters actually are and how they impact elections. How do you define working class voters? And is there something even more specific in how you define rural working class voters?
At the most broad level, we define working class voters as people without a college degree I think some people define working class in terms of income levels, but you can also be a high income working class person. And then some people, especially in rural places, define working class as folks who are more working with their hands, right? But for the purposes of kind of our data analysis, we just stick to college, non-college as a dividing line, and it works pretty well.
You wrote in a Newsweek article, quote, "Don't assume all rural people are MAGA Republicans, nor all people of color are Democratic voters." And that speaks to common assumptions and persistent stereotypes about people in rural areas. Another assumption is that all people in rural areas are working class and white. Where do you think these ideas come from, and why do you think they persist?
I think, honestly, a lot of people don't like to talk about race. And so they'll say rural voters when what they really mean is white working class people, because they don't want to talk about people being white. So they use this kind of code word that then really muddies the waters. About 1 in 4 rural people are people of color. And that's a lot. It's a lot more than most people think. And there are a lot of rural places that are majority people of color. So in the South, there are a lot of majority Black rural areas. In the Southwest, in Texas, Arizona, you're going to have a lot of majority Latino rural areas. There are a lot of places that are majority Native American. I think a lot of people think of rural as being kind of Midwestern, and rural areas in the Midwest are whiter than in some of the other parts of the country. So that might be part of it.
What do you think is interfering with a general sense or understanding of rural areas as being more racially diverse? What do you think keeps the narrative so static?
I think a lot of the commentary about rural people comes from people who live in cities, right? People who live in cities make a lot of the content, and they don't have a lot of experience with rural places. And so when you say the word rural, it conjures up a stereotype in their minds. And most people think about farmers. And many people think of farmers as being white. And there are reasons for that. For example, stealing land from Black farmers and indigenous farmers. Rural people are not just all farmers. Less than 6% of people living in rural places have jobs that directly tie to farms. So most rural people are just like everybody else. They are service workers, they're teachers, they're healthcare workers, childcare, restaurant workers, warehouse workers, people doing transportation. A lot of the jobs that people have in the cities and suburbs are also the main jobs that people have in rural places. And so then when you get that picture of like, oh yeah, we're talking about restaurant workers or Walmart workers, then you start to get a little bit more of a diverse picture of rural people.
I wanted to shift to connecting this to politics. And I'm curious what you think these assumptions get wrong as it relates to the politics of people in rural areas.
Most people think of rural as being conservative and Republican. And it is true that rural places are more Republican, but they're not that much more conservative. They just are culturally Republican at this point. And a lot of that is due to decades of neglect from progressive organizations and neglect from political campaigns on the Democratic side. And so folks haven't had much of an opportunity to even know what Democratic elected leaders could do in their communities. And also there's a caricature of urban people and a caricature of Democrats that also is born out of a lack of familiarity. What we find in our polling is that rural people are actually very aligned with urban and suburban folks in terms of many issues. So abortion is a great example. The polls that we did in April and September both showed that 77% of, and we often lump together small town and rural folks because they all kind of are neglected by the philanthropic and political establishment. So small town and rural folks, either they think that abortion should be available for people and people should have the opportunity to make their own choices about their bodies, or They personally don't approve of abortion, but they think people should have the opportunity to make choices about their bodies. The other place where I think rural people are very aligned is on populist economic policies. Rural folks, they do understand what it means to get screwed by corporations and rich people and corporate corruption. And so they're very strongly in favor of things that are kind of pro-worker policies, labor unions supportive of equal pay between women and men, and making sure that large corporations and wealthy people are doing their fair share. Rural people are very strongly in favor of affordable access to healthcare and lower prescription drug prices, access to childcare for everyone. So the place where you see the big dividing line is as soon as you put that partisan label. So if you talk about a policy and then you say a Democrat supports this policy, then you're going to see about a 20% drop off in support for that policy as soon as you put the partisan label on it. And I think it's because people in small towns and rural areas, they don't fundamentally believe that Democrats have their back. And so then they don't understand that these policies that they actually are in favor in correlate with Democratic positions. And so it's one of the reasons why we exist. We're part of a research project called the Winning Jobs Narrative. And it's a narrative project that was started after 2020 to really think about how to communicate with working class people about jobs and the economy in a way that is most resonant for folks. Working people are the engines of the economy. And when working people thrive, the community thrives. And the best thing that you can do for working people is to make sure that you're lowering costs and increasing wages. And it has been wonderful to see, for example, the Harris campaign really using those building blocks for her economic narrative, impacting a kind of more compelling message for working class people.
So from childhood, I have known the character and work ethic of our small business owners. And I know small business owners are the backbone of America's economy. Which is why my plan offers a new way forward. I know what it is like for people to work hard and to save up and have a dream that is about the dignity of their work and an investment in their future, the future of their family, an investment in the pride they so rightly deserve because of their hard work.
I grew up in a small town working class family, and my whole life, I have been trying to get the attention of Democrats to say, you should be the party for working people. Like, just say that over and over and over again. We're the party for working people.
Why haven't Democrats done a better job? Why haven't Democrats intervened in some way that's been effective?
When you're running a campaign, you have limited time and money, and you really have to apply it in the place where you can get the most votes. And so if you're trying to run a campaign statewide in Wisconsin, and you know you have to get 50% plus one, and you have a limited amount of money, then the biggest money you're going to spend is in Madison and Milwaukee and the cities and suburbs where there are more voters who agree with your position. And that makes sense. The problem is rural voters and small town voters are half of the Wisconsin electorate. So if you only do that, then you're missing half of the state. So it doesn't feel intuitive, I think. If you're running a campaign, you want to go to where your base of support is, but you also then have to pay attention to your high opportunity voters in small towns and rural places.
In the urban versus rural framework, one of the main points of tension is that urban equals educated and rural is synonymous with uneducated. This results in an elitism that shames rural people and casts them as angry and resentful. It's sort of a common trope. Mm-hmm. And there's a suggestion that if rural people were educated, they would vote for their interests represented by Democrats as opposed to the Republicans who are routinely elected. I'm interested in what you have to say about that.
When you think about the urban-rural polarization, A lot of it does come from rural people feeling negatively stereotyped. And this idea of ignorant, angry rural people is a huge part of the problem. One of our programs just hosted a farm tour in rural Wisconsin. And we heard from people on the farm tour, like, wow, farming is so complicated. The things that you need to know about the economy and international trade, chemistry and management in order to run a farm is incredible. Rural people are highly intelligent and they are doing complicated things, often against steep odds, and don't like when people tell them that they're stupid. And just because you don't have a college degree doesn't mean that you're not educated. And then this idea of voting against your interests, it doesn't take into account that people have many interests. And so maybe you're voting for a leader who isn't representing your economic interest, but they are representing a cultural interest. And your interest is actually having a representative who reflects your community and your culture. For working class people, especially if you're in a rural area, you got a lot of struggles, right? You don't have access to childcare. Your local hospital is closing. Your local senior care facility is closing. You're moving your parents back into your home. You have to drive a long ways to work. Your road is washed out, right? You're dealing with that kind of stuff all day long. And so you want to see that when you turn out and vote, that people are paying attention to those very practical issues that impact your lives. Don't assume that people don't know what their interests are. The other thing is that rural people do have some distinct values. Sometimes they're voting with their values. Rural people are much more likely to have patriotism as a core value that guides their decision making. And it's really linked with a love of place and a loyalty to your place. That's how they feel patriotic. And you don't hear a lot of patriotic messaging coming from the progressive movement. Progressives historically, or at least over the past decades, haven't felt really comfortable speaking to a love of country in the same way. And so then right there, you're kind of building a divide between people's values and the folks who would like to represent them. And that's what people are listening for. They're listening for, is this person like me? Is this person going to care about people like me? And they're listening for those cultural cues. And they're often not hearing them from Democrats and progressives. I think it's one thing that the Harris-Walz campaign has done really well is to insert a kind of a patriotic message back into what it means to be a Democrat, really focused on freedom.
Something I'm sure you're well aware of is, as you were talking about values and people making the argument that they're voting against their interests, or if they're voting for their interests and they're voting for somebody who's racist. And I wonder if you can speak to that really explicit message that emerged in the last election and is emerging right now again.
Yeah, I think one of the quickest ways to cut off the opportunity to connect with somebody is to assume and name somebody as racist. So I think that is, again, a part of the divide, is people feel like they're being judged as racist. Not to say that there aren't profound racist forces in our country and in our politics everywhere. But one of the things that we've found works really well in rural spaces is the value of in-group care, or community care, we sometimes call it. So it's people who care about people who are in their community. And so if you are working to combat a racist frame, one of the best ways to do that is just to extend who is in your in-group, right? So immigration is a great example. When you talk about immigrants as your neighbors and people who are working hard in your community and paying their taxes just like everybody else, suddenly you're bringing immigrants into your in-group. When they know immigrants and they think of them as their neighbors, they are much more likely to defend against anti-immigrant policies and to be outraged that people would consider removing them from their families and communities. So I think centering it on shared values is really a great way to approach the conversation.
In an article you wrote in Convergence magazine in December 2022, You mentioned strategies that were beginning to win over rural voters who had shifted right. Things like year-round organizing, a focus on populist economic policies, better messaging to overcome perceived cultural divides, and locally rooted working-class candidates. How have those strategies influenced rural voters almost 2 years later?
Those are still strategies that work very well today. One of the really unfortunate trends is lack of access to high-quality information. Rural people, again, because they're so rooted in place, really rely on local news sources, your local paper, radio station, television station, and those outlets are going away, they're going under, or they're being taken over by more kind of right-wing news conglomerates. And increasingly, folks are going online to digital sources for their news. Rural people are very relational. Relationships are the most important thing. And so a lot of digital news sources are based on social media algorithms that are highly relational. And so rural people are just relentlessly targeted with disinformation. And so it's really important from our perspective that if you're working for progress, that you use every media source available to you. And I'll just say yard signs and billboards, I know people laugh at those, but they make a huge difference in a small town or rural area where everybody knows their neighbors and they are looking for those cues about what to think. And one of our groups that we work with is running just kind of a mass yard sign effort. And they found that for every yard sign you put up, you have at least 5 relational conversations with your neighbors. So it's a very inexpensive way to start those relational, high-quality information conversations with your neighbors. The other thing that is important is just visibility. Just by being visible as a Democrat or as somebody who is standing up for progress, it creates a permission structure for other people then to have that conversation or to start thinking a little bit differently. Make sure that you're advertising in your local paper, get on your rural radio show, door knocking, phone calls, and then digital social conversations, right? Where people are texting people that they know, having a conversation. That's probably the quickest way to move outcomes. In terms of the impact that we're having, we have been looking at elections in small town and rural Wisconsin over the past 4 years. And every year, the election gets slightly more progressive. So sometimes it's nonpartisan, like there was just an election around whether the governor would have the ability to spend federal funds. And it actually had a much stronger support level in rural places because I think people in rural places really rely on federal funding, like if they're having a flood relief or something like that, and they want to make sure that the governor is able to release those funds. So every year it's getting slightly better.
That's amazing and very hopeful sounding. And I'm so glad for all of the work that you've been doing for years because, as you noted, it's sustained activity. It's not just a few months before an election, when I'm glad to hear that you're seeing some payoff. And I think it sounds like, though, the real test is what happens with the ballots that get counted for the November elections. But so it's hard to get a sense of how rural people would ultimately vote if the structural support was there for every single person to actually be able to vote.
Yes, and especially rural young people and rural people of color are the ones who are most likely to want to vote for progress, have the most barriers in terms of voter ID requirements. Their polling places get closed, and then they have to drive a long way and stand in a long line. They're feeling under threat while they're standing in line because the local government has created a hostile atmosphere. And so there's a lot of intervention that you need civic engagement groups to do all year, every year, to make sure that people are able to access their right to vote and have their votes counted. It's going to be quite a venture between now and the end of November.
Sarah, thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been informative, helpful, hopeful. Sarah Jaynes, Executive Director of Rural Democracy Initiative. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Sarah underscores the need for sustained and genuine engagement with rural voters year-round and between election cycles. And while this would likely have an impact on elections, it could also shift the narrative about rural voters. Not only would showing up go far in demonstrating that the Democrats care about rural communities and small towns, but it could begin to build a bridge across the rural-urban divide. Now let's head back to the East Coast to hear from Orlando. You are someone who, born, raised, living in New York City. So I'm curious where you get your ideas about rural areas. Where do they come from?
Largely from the media. And when I say media, I'm even including TV and movies and the way that certain areas are depicted in those settings, but also news media. I mean, I think that there has been this idea for a long time that there are these large groups of poor white people in very rural areas. And for quite a few years now, the argument has been made that specifically Democrats have done a poor job of reaching those people, which, may or may not be true. I mean, I believe it is. And that has also fed into my beliefs of what exists in those areas versus what maybe doesn't.
Orlando isn't alone in this. Both he and Sarah talk about the disconnect between what the media portrays and the reality of rural areas, which feeds into damaging stereotypes and fractured relationships. And while the Democratic Party may have neglected rural voters, except for the few months before an election, there's a lot of folks who build relationships with their neighbors day after day, year after year. Bonnie Dobson is one of these people. Welcome, Bonnie Dobson, Deep Canvas Program Manager with Down Home, North Carolina.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Down Home, North Carolina does extensive organizing across the state with a focus on poor and working class people by poor and working class people. Who do you consider working class?
I consider working class the majority of us, honestly, whether we're living in a rural area or the suburbs or the city. We're going out there every day trying to make a living, trying to keep a roof over our heads, trying to keep our kids fed. Working class people are our base. And those are the people that we want to bring into this movement. But really, our values probably go a long way to attracting those types of folks. Housing for all, healthcare for all. People shouldn't have to work 3 jobs to put food on the table. It's those deep-seated values of making sure everybody is taken care of.
Do you experience resistance to this message or these values as you're out there organizing?
Sometimes there's resistance. But I think if you really ask questions and you're compassionate, you're vulnerable with them, telling them your story, we align on a lot of these things. And I think that what the media does and what corporations do is try to divide us when actually we have so much more in common than we think. And their attempts to divide us kind of fade away when we get out there and really try to build relationship with folks.
Why the emphasis on poor and working class people? Why not have it be a cross-class effort, and explicitly so?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because they've been left out of the conversation for so many years, and they haven't been talked to, they haven't been organized. We have 100 counties in North Carolina, and 80 of them are rural. Those are our people. Those are the people that we need to reach, because just trying to organize them every 4 years to vote isn't enough. We need to find out what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their issues are. And 9 times out of 10, when we get out there and we start talking to people, our values align. We really do all want the same thing, regardless of our color.
Can you say a little bit more about the ways race and class are operating on the ground? How do people talk about it? And how do you talk to them about it?
Some of my organizing is done by canvassing on the phone. Most people don't know when I'm talking that I'm African American. And so sometimes I'll hear things that aren't always nice to hear. I'll put it that way. This one time in particular, I was talking to a gentleman, and he basically said that blacks were lazy, that he grew up in the projects. He self-described as Hispanic, worked all his life, worked really hard, but he saw in his neighborhood that blacks were just not going to work. Women were getting their nails done, and a lot of stereotypes, just really horrific stereotypes. And so I quietly waited for him to finish. I asked him a bunch of questions about more of his experience, because I really wanted to know what his experience was like. And then when he finished, I told him I was Black. And that's not my experience. My experience is I started working when I was 15. So did my sisters. We worked wherever we could because we needed to be able to buy our own clothes. My parents couldn't afford that. And I said, what I feel like I'm hearing from you is stuff that you hear on the news or stuff that the media is feeding you. And the media feeds me too sometimes. I heard that, everybody's coming over here to take my job, but I don't believe it. I said, you're not over here to take my job, are you? You're just over here to build a life for yourself, for you and your family, just like me. I'm here trying to build a life for myself, for me and my 3 kids. I want them to be happy and healthy, have a good education, and have a chance. At the end of the conversation, he said, I've never really talked to a Black person. I really want to thank you because I was thinking some of those things were wrong, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know what to believe. And I said, yeah, it's hard, right? You hear all this stuff and you're thinking, oh no, these people are coming over to take my jobs. These people are lazy and you just don't know what to believe until you sit down with someone and really talk to them. You don't know their story. You don't understand those common values. You'll never come together unless you do that.
Was this guy in a rural area?
Yeah, he was.
So my sense of down home North Carolina is that you all organize across geography, so even in suburbs and urban areas within North Carolina, no?
Some, but we really do try to focus on rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
When this organization started back in 2017, it was right after Trump got elected in 2016. And North Carolina went for Trump. And a lot of those rural counties went for Trump. And we wanted to find out why. And so we just started our organizing there, asking questions about, what keeps you up at night. And that's where we landed, is that those folks weren't talked to. Nobody went out there and just found out what they wanted. And it's a whole lot of folks that we're leaving behind, across the country, really, when we don't talk to rural people.
From your perspective and the work you're doing, do you see a stark contrast between rural and urban voters?
Yeah, I'd have to lean towards no. I think that the media tries to show rural and urban voters as completely different. Like these are the hicks and these are the city folk. And it's really not like that. We live in rural areas, but we're out there working and doing the thing every day. And I think they want the same things we want. There's more organizations that will organize in urban areas because it's easier. Organizing in more rural areas is harder.
Yeah.
But it's worth it.
So you see more overlap than not. I'm so interested in how this idea of the divide persists.
In my mind, it is the way we think about the two areas that speaks to the divide. You think about rural and you're conjuring the flags and the pickup trucks, and you think of urban as these, wonderful little cities and pockets that have everything that they need. You think that we are divided, but we're not. This past spring, we went out and talked to voters in rural areas about abortion. And we would see those Trump flags in the yard and still knock that door and talk to the folks about abortion. And the majority of folks agree with legal abortion. People thought we were crazy because they said that they'll never talk to you about it, but they do.
When I was talking to Sarah Jaynes, she said something about shared values around even progressive policies, whether it's around the economy or housing. But as soon as you say Democrat, they're just like, no. Like at some point, you got to kind of maybe say, vote for the Democrat because that the policy is going to benefit you. So how do you transcend that? How do you get beyond that reactive place of once you say Democrat, I'm done listening?
The way we do it at Down Home is through deep canvassing. It's going out and asking people, how are you doing in this economy? They'll tell you. And then you can relay your story. Yeah, it's hard for me too. Every time I go to the grocery store, I'm like, God, I come home with fewer bags and I spent more money. We can both relate to that. And then you can tie that in to the policies of the Democrats. People need that connection. They tend to vote against their own self-interest. But if you meet them where they're at, you're vulnerable with your own experience by helping them understand that I'm in your shoes. You're in my shoes. And here's why I vote for this person. It's been working for us. It bridges that divide. I even used it on some of my friends when George Floyd was murdered, because they posted a bunch of stuff on social media that I was floored by. And I realized if I cut them all out, I would cut out almost all of my friend group. So I needed to go back and try to understand what they were talking about, where they were coming from. I was able to explain where I was coming from, and we were able to come to some sort of agreement that what happened wasn't right. We can agree on that, and then we can move forward.
You said something a moment ago about voting against self-interest. Can you say a little bit more about that and what self-interest people are voting against and why you think that's happening?
For me, the Republican Party is about lowering the taxes for the rich. They're not for the working class people, let's put it that way. And people are falling for this falsehood that we've got this trickle down and it'll all come to you eventually, instead of understanding that it's never going to come to us that way. We're going to have to organize and fight for what we want. And that the Democrats are closer, by all means they're not perfect, but closer in their policies to making sure social programs continue. A lot of people need those social programs, but they'll vote with Republicans who want to cut those social programs out because they don't really know. No one's really talked to them about it. They just hear the same echo chamber that resonates with them, and that's who they vote for.
Right. So what's in that echo chamber of messaging that you think is appealing to people? This often is what folks cite as race, racism, and white supremacy as the driving force behind working class white people voting against their economic self-interest because they're being influenced by race-based arguments. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, over and over again. If it's not blacks, then it's Hispanics. It seems like to me the other side always has somebody to blame, and then they do it in such an effective way that white working class people believe that this is what's happening. Those stereotypes are not correct, but they believe that blacks are lazy. They believe that Latinos are coming in and taking their jobs. But if you ask them, what's your experience with that? Have Latinos come in and taken your job? What's your connection? They don't have one.
Ultimately, you're having these conversations to move people toward maybe voting for their self-interest or for Democrats, more progressive policies. So then are you seeing that play out with people's voting? Are more people A, voting, or B, voting for Democrats, progressive candidates? What are the kind of measurements there to gauge whether or not what you're doing is having an effect on the voting side?
At Down Home, we do organize year-round. Sometimes it's issue-based, and when elections come up, it's politically based. So that abortion script that we went out with this past spring, it really was about the North Carolina governor's race. But that's not where we started. We started with, do you believe in abortion on a scale of 1 to 10? And then asking about abortions. And then saying, well, we have one person in the race who wants legal abortion, who wants to keep people safe. And we have the other candidate that wants to eliminate it for any reason. And after we've gone through our stories and then we get there and start talking about the candidates, typically we'll move someone. We moved a host of people with that argument around abortion. We moved them towards our candidate.
If I'm remembering correctly, you're talking to hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find my number. 319,000 doors, on our way to 500,000 doors this year.
Just in this year?
Just this year.
Are there certain voters you're talking to and others you're just deciding we can't go there? Because what you're describing sounds lovely, right? These conversations where there's connection and understanding, it's amazing. And yet that really intense political division is, some of it is real. And so where is that in the work you're describing?
We run into folks that just, for whatever reason, they cut themselves off from having discussions. They stop you right at the door. And it usually, that stop begins with, wait a minute, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Because of our progressive values, if you want to call it progressive values, I just call them really down-home values. You start talking about it, and if they absolutely are entrenched in their camp, they will not listen to you no matter what. I have gotten through once or twice by talking about their children, and because the American dream for them might have been possible, but it's not necessarily possible anymore for their kids. And bringing that to light, sometimes you can connect a little bit, but then they're back in their camp. You know, they just need to work harder and work smarter. If they work hard, everything's going to work out fine. And I try to explain that that's not always the case for everybody. Sometimes people need a hand up, and you might not get to them. And that's when you thank them for sharing that time with you and bid them a good day. And that's all you can do. Maybe just plant a seed.
I'm moved by this, and it sounds to me like your organizing strategy is the same spirit of generosity and openness that's really striking and not what we're often hearing about when it comes to political conversations. Does your strategy change depending on who you're talking to?
No, it really doesn't. At the end of the day, arguing with people, being judgmental, spouting facts, absolutely does not work. That entrenches people back in their corners, and they put up their dukes. They get very defensive. But listening to their stories and asking really curious questions, yeah, you can reach people that way.
Amazing. Is there anything I haven't asked that you want to share?
Just this. This is really a simple model for talking to anybody. Somehow we have gotten away from it. I don't know how. But we need to do more listening to everybody, because I think we can form stronger bonds that way. We can come together that way, and we can really have a very powerful movement if we just listen to one another.
May it be so. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for all the work that you're doing with Down Home North Carolina, and I'm wishing you a lot of ease in this run-up to the November election. Bonnie's experience illustrates the power of listening, but even more so, of showing up. It's exactly the antidote to decades of disconnect between Democrats and rural voters. As John Russell explained at the Democratic National Convention,
across the country, working class people are looking for a political home after years of both parties putting profit above people. Right now, it is our choice to build on this progress and to create a political home for the mass of working Americans fighting for control over their government, their workplaces, and their planet. And it is our moment to live up to.
There's an opportunity to bridge the rural-urban divide for a more unified working-class electorate. In next week's episode, we confront a major obstacle to this kind of solidarity: the media. We'll dig deep into what works and what doesn't when it comes to media messaging, how YouTube is changing the game, and just how well the Republican strategies are really doing.
This is what conservative media, by the way, does so well. It makes you think conservatism is a proxy for being working class.
That's next week on Shifting Terrain. If you like what you've heard and want to talk about it with someone you know, please share this episode. Shifting Terrain was executive produced by Amanda Cowper and myself, Rachel Rybaczuk, Production consulting and audio mixing by Karen Given. Associate producer is Emilce Quiroz. Music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you to our guests, Sarah Jaynes, Bonnie Dobson, and Orlando. And a special thank you to eMedia. See you next week.